Hello, dear friends. It's Philip Roseman again with the penultimate, with the last but one lecture on Foucault's history of sexuality. I have one more to record for you on the final and fifth part of the book. I'm not going to wait with that until next Friday, but I'm going to pretend that Monday is a normal class day, although I realize it's a bank holiday. The reason I'm going to do that is to give you an opportunity to complete watching the whole set of lectures, the whole series of lectures, as soon as possible, so that you can start thinking about your essays. It would be unfortunate if you had to wait with that until Friday or until another whole week. Okay, so before I start with this lecture on part 4, chapter 4, which I think is going to be relatively straightforward this time. It's not one of the most difficult chapters. I want to make a remark about your essays. So, as you know, your essays for this class are due on May 15th, that is to say about 2 weeks from now. Which means that thinking about essay topics and getting the whole essays underway is now a priority. Note that I can give you extensions if you need them, but I would suggest that you treat the possibility of extensions carefully, I would say for your own sake. We have, as I mentioned before, the philosophy department staggered the deadlines of our third year essays in such a way that there's one essay coming due each week. If you decide to ask me for an extension, I will say yes. But then you'll have 2 essays coming due the following week, and I'm not sure that will actually help you. It may help you more to stick with the schedule that we've set in the philosophy department. Also bear in mind that the extensions have to be relatively short, because we're aiming for we as the lecturers have to complete our marking by several days before the summer examination board meets. Perhaps third reflection. If you are under terrible pressure and you think that you're not going to manage doing the essay, you can use the opportunity of the August resits. Whether that is something that you want to consider, well, is really something up to each of you. I'm in no position to judge whether that's a kind of emergency break that you have to pull, but it is a possibility that's open to you. As far as topics are concerned, as you know, I much prefer using topics that have been suggested to me by students in the class. The reason for that is that I want to make sure, A, you have something to write on that you find interesting, as opposed to something that I find interesting. Secondly, if you suggest topics, I think you may find it not only more interesting, more engaging to write the essay, I think you may also find it easier, because you can suggest topics that bring in knowledge that you have from other classes. Comparisons, let's say, between Foucault and something that you've read in another class, where you come to the essay with a good amount of background knowledge. Again, if I come up with topics, I don't exactly know what your background knowledge is, etc., etc. So it's better if you make suggestions. I have created... I have put a lecture announcement out there on Moodle. A student, Matthew Roche, has started a thread in the discussion forum. He's already made 2 very good suggestions for essay topics that are out there for you to look at. Please join our discussion in the discussion forum. Finally, I would like to say, if you find it useful that we have something like a real class, we can't have a real class right now, but we could have a synchronous class as opposed to asynchronous. Asynchronous means I record a video and you look at the video whenever you have time or feel like doing so. Synchronous means all of us or several of us meet on Teams and have a discussion. If that's useful, if you will, as a kind of final class to review the material, to look at questions together, to talk about essay topics, I would be more than happy to do that. Would be no problem at all. We would just have to find, so for example, it could be scheduled, because might be difficult to bring to, that might be the most straightforward way of scheduling it, at the time of our next class on Friday, next Friday at 10. If you like, let me know, and we'll make the appropriate arrangements. My main concern now is to wrap up the class in a orderly fashion, in a way that allows you to succeed and perhaps also, as you know, despite the circumstances, have a little bit of fun with the material, enjoy studying, enjoy writing the essay. All right. To the lecture. So today we're going to look at part 4, chapter 4, which is entitled Periodization. The title itself doesn't require much of a commentary because the word is self-explanatory, periodization. So for our projected study of the history of sexuality, why am I saying projected? Well, volume 1 is called an introduction, and then in volumes 2, 3, and 4, Foucault is implementing this project that he is sketching out in the introduction. So for our project of a history of sexuality, we need a tentative periodization, a tentative, chronology that can guide us in our research in the subsequent volumes. Foucault, by the way, found, as he wrote volumes 2, 3, and 4, that he had to abandon much of what he sketched out in volume 1. So one of the interesting aspects of reading Foucault, but also an aspect that makes it more difficult to read Foucault, is the fact that he is an author in motion, more than other philosophers. Some other philosophers are also in motion. Take Heidegger. Heidegger is in motion. There's an earlier Heidegger, a later Heidegger. Nietzsche, to some extent, is in motion. Other philosophers are more static. My standard example of that is Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has an idea at age 25, and then until he dies, he keeps repeating the idea. That makes it relatively easy, straightforward to read Schopenhauer. Once you've understood what Schopenhauer is about, it just keeps coming back. With someone like Foucault, this is different. You may have understood one of Foucault's books, then if you read another, you will find that Foucault has changed. His approach has changed. He's very dynamic, very self-critical also. And so that's the case too with the history of sexuality. This also accounts for the fact that some of his chapters, so for example, if you looked at my lecture on chapter 3, the last lecture, you noticed that that's not an easy chapter. The reason that it's not easy is that much of it is presented in the mode of a sketch, not completely fleshed out. Sometimes with the periodization, I've already drawn your attention to that a few times, you're not completely sure sometimes. Is he saying this starts in the 17th century or is it starting in the 18th century? So that makes it a little bit difficult to read the material. But Foucault takes it for granted that you're going to read him with a certain critical distance. That's important to him. He doesn't want you to become an acolyte, just an ardent follower of Foucault who just screaming, Foucault is right, Foucault is right. That's not what he wants at all. He once described his own work as a toolbox for people to take concepts, ideas out, to conduct their own research. Okay, so periodization. He begins on the first page, 115, by giving again a sketch for the 5th or 6th time now of the repressive hypothesis that he wants to refute in his own history of sexuality, and he sketches the periodization, the chronology, which would come with that repressive hypothesis. This chronology has 2 steps. In the course of the 17th century, I can read it to you, 115, just a few lines down. The first stage in this chronology of the repressive hypothesis which he wants to reject is occurring in the course of the 17th century. This stage was characterized by an advent of the great prohibitions, the exclusive promotion of adult marital sexuality, the imperatives of decency, the obligatory concealment of the body, the reduction to silence and mandatory reticences of language. Okay, first step. And then the second step is the 20th century phenomenon, as he says. It's a loosening of this repression. So there are 2 steps. 17th century, repression of sexuality begins, then 20th century, liberation. As you already know, because he said it many times, he is highly skeptical of the repressive hypothesis and therefore also of the periodization which comes with it. So what is Foucault's alternative theory? Well, the alternative theory is in the book, so I can't summarize that now in a word. We've been talking about this for some weeks now. But what's his alternative periodization? Well, okay, so that's the subject matter of this chapter. Foucault takes a much, what should I say, how can one put it, he has a deeper perspective on things, or well, a more long-term perspective on things is perhaps the right word. So for him, if we want to understand how we are living sexuality in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have to go back to the Middle Ages. That's, I think, theoretically very, very attractive, because it allows us to see the present against the background of a long-term history, as opposed to saying, well, what we live now was created 100 years ago. I think it's more, well, profound. And historically more satisfying to look at really long-term development. So for Foucault, if you want to understand how we live our sexuality now, we have to look at 116 penitential practices of medieval Christianity. He did talk about this earlier, if you remember. He talked about the way in which we become confessing animals through a series of transformations of the originally Christian practice of confession, which in contemporary society has become a secular practice, the secular practice of feeling compelled constantly to tell everyone who we are, in terms of, above all, in terms of sex and in terms of race. So this idea is not new in Foucault's book, but he returns to it here now. So the penitential practices of medieval Christianity had the effect, which he associates with the First Council of the Lateran, 1215, okay, had the effect of encouraging introspection in people, practice of confession. You know, I'm guilty of such and such. Before I can make such a statement, I have to ask myself, well, who am I? Also, by the way, who do I want to be? Because if I say I am guilty of such and such a sin, that means I've moved away from this conduct and I actually want to be someone else. So therefore, confession is, as Foucault would say, a technique of the self. It's a way to shape the self, right? And of course, in these penitential practices, they were not all about sex, not at all, because there are 10 commandments, not all of which have to do with sexuality, but these penitential practices certainly concerned the sexual area also. In this first paragraph on page 116, if you look at it a little bit more closely, Foucault talks about the way in which these medieval practices were then affected by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, so that you get, well, two strands running parallel but still not the same in these techniques of the self, namely a Catholic one, and then of course from the time of the Reformation onwards a Protestant one. Well, you see, not completely irrelevant, let's say, in the context of Ireland, because I mean, obviously, especially in the north, you have lots of people who would not be able to find themselves in a kind of exclusively Catholic account of stuff. Okay, now so that's Foucault's. We're now talking about Foucault's own periodization. First step, these traditional technologies of the flesh, as he calls them. Second step, of which he starts talking in the second full paragraph at the bottom of page 116. The second step occurs at the end of the 18th century, he now says. By the way, I've said this too often now, but if you at one point have an opportunity to read this book really closely, whatever, further studies of philosophy, whatever the occasion could be, it would be interesting to compare the various statements that he makes about the 17th century, the 18th century, and 19th century. Are these all consistent, or does he sometimes make contradictory claims? I suspect the latter may be the case, but that would be a subject matter for further research. So at the end of the 18th century, what happens is that there emerged, as he says, a completely new technology of sex. But you see, it's completely new, right? I mean, perhaps from one point of view. But what he really wants to argue is new in that, for the most part, it escaped the ecclesiastical institution without being truly independent of the thematics of sin. So you see, he says completely new, but then he says, well, not completely new. Because basically what's happening now is a transposition of these Christian penitential practices onto secular terrain. We're still asking ourselves, who are we, who do we want to be, in what respect are we guilty, what have we done that's wrong, but we're no longer framing it in terms of sin and transgression of some divine law, we're framing it in secular terms. And Foucault points out three areas in which sex becomes a matter of intense interest. The areas that he mentions are pedagogy, having to do with the sexuality of children, medicine, which he says at that point focused particularly on the sexuality of women. You remember from the previous chapter he was talking about the hysterization of women. And thirdly, he mentions the area of demography. So, one way in which he puts, again, he has this gift for pithy phrases, one way in which he puts this secularization of Christian penitential techniques occurs at the bottom of page 117, where he says that, sorry, I had to pause there for a second because the postman rang and brought a couple more books. I was talking about page 117, where Foucault uses a pithy phrase, as I said, to summarize the transposition onto secular terrain of Christian penitential practices. He says, 117, just a few lines down from the bottom of the page, the flesh was brought down to the level of the organism. Because you see, in the Christian tradition, the flesh doesn't simply mean, well, the physical flesh that I have on my body, but it means temptation. It means opportunity for transgression and sin and so forth. And so in a Christian perspective, penitential practices have to do with, well, examination of conscience, making sure, the person the penitent lives in accordance with God's will. In the secular world, that of course is not the point at all. The point is rather, well, as he says, on the one hand, pedagogical, medical, and demographic. Perhaps the most interesting one to dwell on here is the demographic point, where starting at the end of the 18th century, the state institutions, governments become interested in the development of their population. That is to say, therefore, in birth rates and therefore in sexuality. So the question of how many people live in Ireland, in France, in Germany, towards the end of the 18th century, it's no longer simply a matter of, well, if you will, fate. People have more children, or there are fewer children, or there's more illness, or there's less illness, etc. But it becomes a matter for the government to take care of, because the governments are beginning to understand the relationship between population and economics. You need to have a certain number of people working and also consuming for the economy to function. Note, and this requires, note at the how on page 116, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the bottom of the page, he talks about surveillance. So this government function requires surveillance. It requires surveillance, that is to say, for example, it requires the undertaking of population census, to make sure we always know how many people live in our country, how large the families are, how many children people have, how many people live, how many people die, and again, ultimately with a perspective that is economic. By the way, so what Foucault is saying, and this will become even clearer when we read the final part, what Foucault is saying on this topic is very relevant to a philosophical analysis and discussion of the current pandemic. How are governments dealing with the pandemic? How do governments feel responsible for the health of their populations, and why? Foucault would be, what should I say, a very fruitful source for discussion of these issues. Interesting are 2 points that that Foucault makes on pages 118 and 119. Interesting, but also a little bit frustrating, because Foucault alludes on page 118 to the creation of eugenics, and 119 he refers to the rise of racism, suggesting that the way in which the state in the 18th century became preoccupied with the very life, the very organic, the very physical existence of the population, created programs of eugenics. What is eugenics? Well, making sure the people who live in your country are as healthy as possible, that hereditary diseases aren't transmitted, and in the worst case, this involves killing people who are mentally or physically disabled. This killing of people who are mentally or physically disabled was, as you know, happened in Nazi Germany. The whole eugenics program, however, was much more widespread. It existed in many other countries, including, I know, the United States. I don't know about Ireland or the UK. But the whole idea that the government had to make sure its population was healthy and people who were suffering from disabilities, etc., were excluded from the possibility of procreation, that was, I can't say universal, but that was very, very widespread. Likewise, racism. So governments become interested in regulating their populations at the very level of their kind of biological existence, therefore becoming interested in sexuality. And, as Foucault is saying here, but just hinting, he doesn't flesh it out at all, governments become interested in race. And racism, again, is a phenomenon that is quite recent. Sometimes in everyday discussions, the impression is created that the Western tradition was racist, let's say, from the Greeks onwards. That's not the case. The very term, as you know, I like looking terms up in dictionaries and not finding them and presenting this as evidence for changes. If you looked up the term racism, I wouldn't even know what it was in Greek or in Latin. You can't even translate it into those languages. Racism is a creation, really, of the 18th century. Foucault is suggesting here when governments became interested in something like the biological health, also purity, of their populations. But again, he hints in a way that I find a little bit frustrating. It would be nice if he had written a few more pages on this. In other works, he elaborates just a little bit, but also not much. Okay. Moving on. The next few pages of the chapter, and when I mean the next few pages, where do these pages start? Really, the section I want to discuss now starts at the bottom of page 119, where you see the number 2. So we have now been discussing number 1. First major point of the chapter. Now we move on to point 2. In those pages, which occupy much of the remaining part of the chapter, Foucault engages really in a discussion with Marx or Marxism, which you can see from the fact that at one point, you've noticed the book doesn't have many footnotes, but at one point on page 126 there's a footnote that refers to Marx. Foucault, however, wants to distance, just as Foucault wants to distance himself from the theory of repression and liberation, so he wants to distance himself from a Marxist account of the rise of sexuality as we now understand it. On the Marxist account, on the Marxist reading, sexual repression set in order to make sure the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes, could best exploit the labor capacity of the working classes. Foucault summarizes this position at the top of page 120. If one writes the history of sexuality in terms of repression, parentheses, which is not what he wants to do, relating this repression to the utilization of labor capacity, one must suppose that sexual controls were the more intense and meticulous as they were directed at the poorer classes. Okay. That's Foucault's summary of this kind of Marxist theory. So again, I think I've already paraphrased it. This theory holds that sexual repression set in basically in order to make sure the working classes weren't kind of dissipating their energies in unnecessary sexual activities, so that the energies could be fully invested into work. Okay? Foucault says, well, he suggests, again, says or argues, he suggests that this is not what actually happened. That is to say that this idea according to which sexual, first of all, he doesn't think sexual repression occurred. Secondly, it didn't occur and it wasn't used in order to exploit or repress lower classes. It's almost the opposite, he wants to say. It's almost the opposite. The techniques of the flesh, he wants to say, were first applied to the bourgeoisie, that is to say, to the ruling classes. If you look at 120, I'm going to read one particular sentence to you. On the contrary, he writes, it's about at the center of the page, the most rigorous techniques were formed and more particularly applied first, with the greatest intensity, in the economically privileged and politically dominant classes. He's going to say why in just a second. At the moment he's elaborating on this point, if you look at page 121, for their part the working classes managed for a long time to escape the deployment of sexuality. So this whole deployment of sexuality, you at this stage of our reading of the book, you know to hear the term sexuality in a very, what should I say, technical way. It doesn't simply mean the fact that we're sexual beings. That's not what Foucault is talking about. Sexuality is this construct that arose in modern times for us to live our sex, if you will, right? And so the working classes managed for a long time to escape the deployment of sexuality. Why? Well, because it started in the bourgeoisie, and then only came to be, implanted in, or was only seeping through to the level of the working classes, as Foucault is suggesting on pages 121, 122, in 3 steps. First, he says, the state realized that the working classes were practicing forms of birth control. And the state said, well, interested in population management, that's not good. So we have to place emphasis on telling the working classes that their sexual health, that their duty as citizens, etc., precludes birth control. Secondly, again on page 120, what Foucault calls the, is it 120 or is it 121? It's 122 already. He says, among the working class, conventional families were promoted. What is a conventional family? Well, a conventional family is what we now call the nuclear family. As opposed to what, really? Well, as opposed to, well, first of all, a worker having possibly sexual relations with several women, but also, larger family arrangements, whole clans living together and so forth. And the third aspect of this deployment of sexuality in the working classes was the suppression of so-called sexual perversions, that is to say, deviant forms of sexuality. In these 3 steps did the sexuality, which first came to affect the bourgeoisie, gradually to be deployed onto the working classes, according to Foucault. Of course, this is his hypothesis. Now, in some sense, what he said about the working classes is a digression. A digression from the topic with which he began under the second point here, namely the whole thinking of oneself in terms of sexuality and in terms of controlling, regulating one's sexuality, started in the bourgeoisie. Why? Well, he makes the following claim. 123. The primary, line 3, by the way, the primary concern was not repression of the sex of the classes to be exploited, but rather the body, vigor, longevity, progeniture, and descent of the classes that ruled. So, if the bourgeoisie came to be interested in its own sexuality, in the pedagogical, medical, and demographic aspects of its own sexuality, it was its own sexuality, because and not so much interest in what the working classes are doing, because the bourgeoisie wanted to make sure it was bodily healthy, vigorous, characterized by longevity, long life, progeniture, well, having healthy offspring, having enough offspring, having healthy offspring, and descent, well, I think that's probably the same as progeniture. So that's what, according to Foucault, explains the fact that in the 18th century the bourgeoisie came to be very interested in sexuality. Another way in which he puts it on page 123, around the center of the page, is this. What was formed was a political ordering of life, not through an enslavement of others, but through an affirmation of self. So the bourgeoisie, at this original point, deployed sexuality not to oppress others, enslave others, but affirm themselves, their own selves. Okay, but ultimately why? Ultimately why? And Foucault has in two places summarizes this quite brilliantly. Why? So why is the bourgeoisie suddenly so interested in a kind of cultivation of their own physical self? We're not now talking about education, that's something completely different. Cultivation of their physical self. Well, he says it's ensuring longevity, etc. Fine, but that's not the whole story. Let's read on. 124, about 10 lines or so from the bottom, okay? The bourgeoisie's blood was its sex. I read on. And this is more than a play on words. Many of the themes characteristic of the caste manners of the nobility reappeared in the 19th century bourgeoisie, but in the guise of biological, medical, or eugenic precepts. That's an interesting thesis. So the bourgeoisie became interested in in its own sexuality in order to constitute a healthy self, because it needed a substitute or an equivalent for the way in which the bourgeoisie defined itself through blood. And then he says, this is more than a play of words. Many of the themes characteristic of the caste manners of the nobility reappeared in the 19th century bourgeoisie. This, by the way, this is well known. Take, for example, the way in which we now dress. Well, we now t-shirt, etc. No, but let's say if you take the traditional gentleman's dress, the tie, the jacket, etc., that gradually filtered, that is a bourgeois imitation of aristocratic dress. Just as if you look at the way in which bourgeoisie, by the way, means nothing but kind of middle class. If you look at the way in which the middle classes lived as they became more affluent, not only dressed but lived as they became more affluent, they were trying to imitate the lifestyle of the aristocracy. But always, of course, on a smaller scale. So you go to a bourgeois, to a wealthy middle class home, let's say in early 20th century Ireland. Well, it would be something like a small castle. I mean, a really small castle, with the living room modeled on the way in which the Lord would have had, a sitting room, etc., etc. By the way, I'm noticing that the video is constantly going dark and going light. I think that has to do with the fact, I apologize for that, that has to do with the fact that the little computer room in which I'm sitting here has a window, and it's very, very sunny outside. So I think in function of how much light comes into the room, the camera is trying to adjust and is not always doing this properly. At any rate, so I think what matters is not so much that you see me super clearly, but that you can hear and understand what I'm trying to say. So the bourgeoisie's blood was its sex. So where the aristocracy defined itself through blood, X is the offspring of the queen or the king, or is related to such a line of aristocratic people. In the bourgeoisie, that's not the case. A wealthy middle class person is not related, to any king or queen or to any count. So how do they define their special status, their aristocratic status, their elevated status in society? Well, what they tried to do was 125. Because of what the cultivation of its own body could represent politically, economically, and historically for the present and the future of the bourgeoisie. So the integrity, the rule, the preeminent position in society of the bourgeoisie is not guaranteed by blood, but by what Foucault calls here, did I say 125, the cultivation of its own body. Cultivation of its own body, which with a strong sexual component. See, Foucault repeats the same point on page 126. I just quote this particular sentence because it summarizes what he wants to argue very, very nicely. 126, about 10 lines down or so. The bourgeoisie converted the blue blood of the nobles into a sound organism and a healthy sexuality. It's very interesting. Very interesting. So let's say, if you look at a modern government which tries to take care of the health of its population, including healthy sexuality, consider, for example, the way in which sex education has become a major political topic in Ireland. This, according to Foucault, is ultimately an attempt to convert the blue blood of the nobles. That is to say, to create something like distinction in society, to ensure the identity of members of society by making sure everybody has a sound organism and a healthy sexuality. Now, this would be the historical origin of this. Is this still the contemporary function? For example, you have kids in whatever primary school who get sex education. Is that to make them into aristocrats? No. That has the motivations there are different. But that would, according to Foucault, be the ultimate historical root of these developments. So, which moved, first of all, the blood of the aristocrats becomes the healthy organism, including healthy sex life of the bourgeoisie, and that then trickles down into the working classes, so that ultimately you have this kind of discourse of health and well-lived sexuality, etc., permeating all of society. This is more or less Foucault's narrative here. So, I've said a couple of times, even today, make sure you understand the term sexuality properly in the context in which we're using it. It doesn't have its everyday meaning in Foucault. If you want to have another definition of the way in which Foucault understands the term, not the first time, but you look at page 127. Sexuality, he says there, 127 about the center of the page, is the set of effects produced in bodies, behaviors, and social relations by a certain deployment deriving from a complex political technology. Well, but also see further down, 127, sexuality is originally historically bourgeois. Okay? Again, understood in a technical sense. Not in the sense that we are sexed beings. That has nothing to do with being bourgeois or not being bourgeois. All right. I'm not going to say much about the final pages of the chapter. So the last quotation that I gave you was from page 127. Okay. What are the last 127 up to 131? What are these pages devoted to? Two topics. One, what is the function for the self-understanding of the bourgeoisie of this whole discourse of repression, which, according to Foucault, is not an accurate representation, doesn't capture properly what actually happened, because, well, he wants to move away from this whole idea of sexuality that's first repressed and then liberated. So he asks himself in the last few pages, where does this even come from, this whole talk about repression? And the second topic that he explores there is connected with what I just said, is what he calls the genealogy, the rise of psychoanalysis. I am not going to try to explain this to you in detail for two reasons. Reason A, I want you to focus on what's essential and not confuse you too much. I hope the lecture today has been clear enough. I think there have been a few digressions and things like that. Sorry about that. I hope, however, that the main points have become clear. So I'm not going to summarize the last few pages that are not to confuse you with perhaps unnecessary detail. Secondly, as I've now already said several times, this book is in some ways experimental. It lays out a research program for the following volumes, 2, 3, and 4 of the history of sexuality, which, however, then went into a different direction. So you could even say that volume 1 is in some ways experimental. And in some pages you can see this experimental character more than in others. And it seems to me that, for example, these last few pages of the chapter that we're in the process of reading are particularly experimental. He paints in very, very broad strokes, makes claims that he's then never going to justify. I wouldn't say that's a huge... See, I don't consider that to be something that one should enormously criticize. It has to do with Foucault's way of thinking and writing. But it also means that I don't want to bother you with claims that he makes that have very little justification in the current context. All right. Thank you for your attention to this lecture. Please do, as I urged you at the beginning of today's class, please do make sure to give thought to the topics for your essays. Make sure to be in touch with me. If you want to talk about the essay topics, please post suggestions to the discussion forum, where you will already see an exchange between myself and the student about essay topics that we've been discussing. If you have more personal concerns about your own situation, etc., send me an email. But I think the most important thing is that we get a discussion going among the participants in the class of how we're going to tackle the second essay, because I want to make this as well interesting but also as manageable for you as possible. For that I need your feedback. If I don't get feedback, well, then I'll simply have to resort in the next few days to coming up with a few topics myself and just making them the official topics, which would not be the ideal solution. Thank you very much, and all the best. Bye bye now.